Merv. The year is 1221 AD, and a Mongol army of over 100,000 soldiers has just surrounded the city on all sides. No way in, no way out. The people inside, over 500,000 of them, had heard the stories. They knew what happened to the cities that came before. Samarkand razed, Urgench flooded, Nishapur turned into a field of skulls. The Mongols weren't just conquering cities, they were erasing them, and Merv had a choice to make. But before we get to that moment, before we talk about what the Mongols did here and why it echoed through centuries, we need to understand what they were looking at from outside those walls. Because from the outside, standing in the desert heat looking at Merv, what you would have seen was something that had no business existing where it did. A city of 500,000 people rising out of one of the harshest deserts on Earth. Turquoise domes glittering in the sun, the sound of water flowing through channels everywhere you walk. Bazaars that stretched for kilometers, packed with merchants from China, India, Persia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean, all trading in the same square on the same afternoon. Libraries with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, observatories, hospitals, gardens that seemed impossible given that just beyond the city walls was nothing but sand and wind for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. This was Merv at its peak, the greatest city of the medieval Islamic world, possibly the largest city on Earth at the time. And I used modern AI tools to reconstruct it, all based on historical records, traveler accounts, archaeological surveys, and what little survives in the ruins today. We are going to walk through this city together. We are going to understand what made it possible, what made it extraordinary, and then we are going to understand what happened to it and why the destruction of Merv was one of the greatest catastrophes in the history of human civilization. Let's start at the beginning. And the beginning of Merv is really about one thing: water. Look at a map of Central Asia, and what you mostly see is desert. The Karakum Desert stretches across what is now Turkmenistan, one of the largest and most hostile deserts on Earth. Temperatures that swing from extreme heat in summer to brutal cold in winter. Almost no rainfall. A landscape that should make large-scale urban civilization simply impossible. And yet, running through this desert is the Murghab River, flowing down from the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, spreading out across the landscape as it hits the flat terrain. And where the Murghab spreads, something remarkable happened. An oasis formed, green in the middle of brown, life in the middle of nothing. The ancient Persians found this oasis thousands of years before our story. They called the region Margiana. They built here. Then the Greeks came. Alexander the Great passed through in 329 BC, and, as he did everywhere he considered strategically important, founded a city. He called it Alexandria Margiana. The Seleucid king who came after him rebuilt and renamed it Antiochia Margiana. City after city, civilization after civilization, the settlement at the Murghab oasis kept being reborn, because the location was too valuable to abandon. But here is what is easy to miss about Merv when you first look at the history. The oasis alone couldn't sustain what Merv eventually became. Yes, the Murghab River made life possible, but it was human engineering that made Merv great, because the people who lived here, over thousands of years, built something that modern hydraulic engineers still study with admiration. One of the most sophisticated irrigation systems the ancient and medieval world ever produced. We are talking about hundreds of kilometers of canals, not simple ditches, but precisely engineered channels with calculated gradient, so the water flowed exactly where it needed to go. Sluice gates that could be opened and closed to direct water to different fields depending on the season and the crop. Distribution networks so carefully designed that water reached farms dozens of kilometers from the river with enough pressure and volume to actually irrigate crops at scale. And crucially, this system required constant human management. There were administrators whose entire job was managing the canals. There were engineers whose entire career was maintaining and expanding them. There were legal structures governing water rights that were more sophisticated than the property law of most medieval European kingdoms. This irrigation system had been built up over 4,000 years of continuous habitation. 4,000 years, each generation inheriting the canals from the previous one, understanding them a little better, expanding them a little further, passing them on. By the time the Seljuk Turks made Merv their imperial capital in the 11th century, the irrigation network was so ancient and so vast that nobody fully understood all of it. It had become part of the landscape itself, as natural seeming as the river it drew from. So when you picture Merv, do not picture a desert city in the way that phrase usually sounds: cramped, dusty, struggling. Picture a green island in a sea of sand, fields of wheat and cotton, and fruit trees stretching to the horizon in every direction outside the wall. Date palms lining every canal bank inside the city. Gardens within gardens within gardens, some of them formal and geometric in the Persian tradition, some of them wild and dense, full of birds. And everywhere, the sound of water moving, in a desert, in a place where water should be the rarest thing in the world. Merv had so much of it that the sound was constant. That is the foundation on which everything else was built. Now, we need to understand the other thing that made Merv what it was: its position on the Silk Road. Do not think of the Silk Road as a single road. It was never that. It was a network, a vast, shifting, branching web of routes connecting China in the east to the Mediterranean in the west, with branches running north into the Eurasian steppe and south into India. Thousands of kilometers of trails, mountain passes, river crossings, and desert tracts across which the entire medieval world conducted its long-distance trade. Silk from China, spices from India and Southeast Asia, horses from Central Asia. The famous Fergana horses that Chinese emperors sent armies to obtain, cotton and dyes from Persia, glassware from Syria, lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan, paper, which the Arabs had learned to make from Chinese prisoners after the Battle of Talas in 751 AD, and which was already transforming the Islamic world's intellectual culture, precious metals, ivory, and with all the goods, ideas, mathematical concept, astronomical knowledge, medical techniques, religious texts, philosophical traditions, artistic styles, everything traveled these routes. And the network had choke points, places where multiple routes converged, where you had to pass through whether you liked it or not. Cities that sat on these choke points became the great trading cities of the medieval world. Merv was one of the most important choke points in the entire network. Routes from China coming through the Tarim Basin converged here. Routes from India coming up through Afghanistan hit Merv before branching west. Routes from Persia and Baghdad came east to Merv. Routes going north into the Eurasian steppe for the horse trade passed through Merv. The city was, in the most literal geographic sense, the place where the world's trade routes met. This meant that Merv was not just a city, it was a node, a place where every merchant going from China to Persia, from India to Baghdad, from the steppe to the Mediterranean, had to stop, rest, resupply, and trade. The caravanserais, the great roadside inns that served the Silk Road's traffic, lined the approach roads for kilometers outside the city walls. Inside the city, the bazaars were not just markets, but internationally diverse trading floors where you might hear a dozen languages in a single afternoon and buy goods from 30 different countries. And this commerce created wealth, enormous, staggering wealth of the kind that only great trading cities generate. Wealth that funded the libraries and the palaces and the mosques and the gardens. Wealth that paid for the scholars and the poets and the astronomers who made Merv one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. Wealth that built a city of 500,000 people in the middle of a desert and kept it there for centuries. Now, let's walk through the gates. The walls of Merv's inner city stretched for over 10 kilometers around the urban core. These were not modest defensive walls. They were massive earthwork fortifications, wide enough at the top for soldiers to walk 4 abreast, with towers projecting at regular intervals. The walls had been built and rebuilt many times over the centuries, each rebuilding, reinforcing, and expanding the previous version. So by the 12th century, they represented not just one fortification, but the accumulated defensive thinking of dozens of generations. Outside the inner city walls was the outer city, where the overflow population lived and where much of the commercial activity happened. The outer city had its own walls, creating a second defensive ring. And beyond those walls were the suburbs and villages and farms that fed the whole system, all connected by the canal network and the road. But today, we are going inside. We are passing through the main gate in the late 12th century, at the absolute peak of Merv's glory, under the Seljuk Sultan Sanjar, a man so powerful that other rulers across the Islamic world paid him tribute and acknowledged his suzerainty. The first thing that hits you as you pass through the gate is not the visual spectacle of the city, though that is coming, but the sound of commerce. Hundreds of merchants and customers and porters and animals all moving and talking and negotiating at once in a dozen different languages, filling the air with a kind of controlled chaos that feels simultaneously overwhelming and alive in a way that is difficult to describe unless you have stood in a great bazaar. The bazaars of Merv were famous across the Islamic world, not just for their size, though size mattered, and Merv's markets were vast, but for what you could find there. Silk and cotton textiles in every color and quality, metalwork from local craftsmen who had developed distinctive techniques over generations, books. Merv was known as a city of books in a way that few medieval cities were. Spices and aromatics from the Indian Ocean trade, horses from the steppe, weapons, pottery, glass, jewelry, food in every variety. And above all this commercial activity rose the city itself. Let me try to give you a sense of what the skyline of Merv looked like at its peak, because it was extraordinary. The dominant visual feature was the Friday Mosque, built on a scale that announced to every arriving traveler that this was a city of power and culture and faith. The mosque's courtyard could hold thousands of worshippers for Friday prayers. Its arcades were lined with columns. Its prayer hall had a ceiling that rose to heights that felt inside, like standing under the sky. The geometric tile work that covered its surfaces, the blues and greens and whites that the craftsmen of Central Asia had perfected, caught the sunlight and scattered it in ways that seemed almost supernatural to visitors who had grown up in regions where such artistry was uncommon. Next to the mosque stood the tomb of Sultan Sanjar, one of the most beautiful buildings in the medieval world. A square base supporting a double dome, an inner dome giving the interior its soaring height, and an outer dome rising even higher to be visible from a distance, covered in turquoise tiles that shimmered in the heat like the surface of a lake. The dome was so carefully engineered that it could be seen from a day's journey away in the clear Central Asian air. Travelers approaching Merv across the flat desert plain would see that turquoise dome for hours before they reached the wall, a beacon announcing that civilization lay ahead. Around these central monuments, the city spread in all directions, a dense urban fabric of houses and shops and workshops and mosques and madrasas, the schools where Islamic religious and scientific education happened, and caravanserais where merchants from distant lands lodged with their goods. The architecture was largely mud brick and baked brick, as it had to be in a region where stone was scarce. But what the builders of Merv lacked in raw materials, they more than compensated for in skill and sophistication. They had developed over centuries a tradition of brick construction that could produce buildings of extraordinary refinement and beauty. Intricate geometric patterns built into the brick surfaces themselves, decorative vaulting covering the transitions between walls and domes, calligraphic inscriptions running along facades in scripts so carefully drawn they were works of art, independent of the words they spelled. But the most remarkable thing about Merv, the thing that set it apart even from other great Islamic cities, was its intellectual life. Merv had libraries, not one, several, by some accounts as many as 10 significant libraries operating simultaneously in the city at its peak. And when I say libraries, I mean institutions of a kind that the medieval world rarely produced. The largest of them, attached to the Great Mosque, held a collection of manuscripts that contemporaries estimated at over 12,000 volumes, an extraordinary figure for the 12th century, when books were produced entirely by hand, and a single volume might represent months of a scribe's labor. These were not just religious texts. Yes, the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence were central, but the libraries of Merv held texts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, history, poetry, geography. They held translations of Greek scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic, the great project of Islamic intellectual culture that preserved and expanded the knowledge of the ancient world while Europe had largely lost access to it. They held Persian literary texts. They held works by scholars who had worked in Merv itself, contributing to the living intellectual tradition of the city. And this library culture was embedded in an educational system centered on the madrasas. Merv's madrasas were not just religious schools in the narrow sense. They were institutions where a student might receive training in jurisprudence and theology alongside mathematics and astronomy. They produced graduates who went on to serve as administrators, judges, physicians, and scholars throughout the Seljuk Empire and beyond. Then there were the observatories. Astronomy was one of the central scientific preoccupations of the medieval Islamic world. For reasons both religious, determining the correct times for prayer required astronomical knowledge, and intellectual. Merv had at least one major observatory where astronomers made systematic observations of the night sky with instruments that were among the most precise of the age. The city sat at a latitude and in a climate, clear desert air with minimal humidity, that made it ideal for observation. Astronomical tables compiled at Merv were used by scholars across the Islamic world. The work done here fed into the broader Islamic astronomical tradition that would eventually, through transmission to Europe, contribute to the scientific revolution centuries later. This was what Merv was, not just a trading city, not just a political capital, a city where the whole human project of understanding the world and organizing society and creating beauty was happening at the highest level the medieval world could achieve. Let's step back now and walk through the streets where ordinary people lived. Because Merv was a city of 500,000, and the vast majority of those 500,000 were not scholars or nobles or successful merchants. They were craftsmen, small traders, farmers, servants, laborers, the people who actually made the city function. An ordinary resident of Merv in the 12th century would have lived in a house of mud brick, flat-roofed in the Central Asian style, built around a central courtyard that provided light, air, and a private outdoor space. The courtyard was the heart of domestic life, where meals were eaten on warm evenings, where children played, where women gathered to work and talk. Wealthier families had larger courtyard houses with rooms on 2 levels, guest quarters separate from family quarters, perhaps a garden with a small pool fed by the canal network. The city was organized by neighborhood. Neighborhoods had their own local mosque, their own bread baker, their own water distribution points from the canal network. A person could meet most of their daily needs without ever leaving their neighborhood. But the great central bazaar was where life really happened, where news was exchanged, where goods from the whole world were available, where the cosmopolitan energy of a Silk Road city was most concentrated. Food in Merv reflected the city's position at the intersection of multiple culinary traditions. Persian cooking, with its emphasis on rice dishes cooked with fruits and nuts and spices, formed the base. Central Asian nomadic traditions contributed roasted meats and dairy products. Indian spices and techniques came in through the trade route. The result was a cuisine of considerable sophistication, complex spice combinations, slow-cooked dishes, an extensive tradition of sweets and pastries made with local honey and imported sugar. Visitors from the Arab world and from Europe, who made it this far, consistently remarked on the quality and variety of the food available in Merv. Water was everywhere in Merv in a way that was genuinely astonishing given the surrounding landscape. The canal network brought water not just to farms, but into the city itself, feeding public fountains, the ablution pools of mosques, the baths, and the private gardens of wealthy residents. The sound of water in a garden or courtyard was a pleasure in itself, and wealthy residents designed their private spaces to maximize it. The baths of Merv deserve special mention because they were not just hygienic facilities, but social institutions. A bath visit was not a quick affair. You might spend 2 or 3 hours there, moving through rooms of progressively higher heat, being washed and massaged by attendants, then cooling down in the outer room. You would meet neighbors and acquaintances, you would hear the latest news and gossip. Business deals were made in the baths, friendships were maintained there. For ordinary people who had no private bathing facilities, the public bath was not a luxury, but a necessity, and the city's bathkeepers were important community figures. Outside the city walls, the agricultural landscape that fed Merv was as carefully managed as the city itself. The fields were not a uniform monoculture. Different crops grew in different areas depending on soil type and water availability. Zones dedicated to grain, wheat, and barley formed the dietary staple. Zones growing cotton produced cloth for local use and for export through the Silk Road. Orchards of pomegranates, figs, mulberries, and apricots produced fruit for fresh eating and for preservation. And there were the herb and flower gardens that produced plants for medicine, for fragrance, and for dye. The farmers who worked this land had secure rights to their fields and could pass them to their children. In good years, which the irrigation system generally ensured, a farmer near Merv could expect a comfortable life with enough surplus to buy goods from the city market. This, then, was the world that existed inside and around Merv in the early 13th century, a world of extraordinary richness and complexity and beauty. A world that had been built up over 4,000 years of continuous effort. A world where the accumulated knowledge and skills and social organization of dozens of generations had combined to produce something genuinely irreplaceable. And then came the Mongols. To understand what happened at Merv in 1221, you need to understand what the Mongol conquests were and what they were not. They were not simply raids. They were not the typical cycles of conquest and absorption that had characterized Central Asian politics for centuries, where one powerful group replaced another, but the basic structure of civilized life continued. The Mongols under Genghis Khan were something new, a military machine of terrifying efficiency whose strategic objective was not just conquest, but the systematic destruction of any organized resistance. When the Mongol army arrived outside Merv's walls, the governor faced an impossible choice. He chose surrender, negotiating a promise of mercy in exchange for opening the gates. The people of Merv walked out carrying their valuables, 500,000 of them, still hoping the promise would hold. It didn't. The massacre that followed was so extreme that historians still debate the exact scale. But the killing wasn't even the most devastating thing the Mongols did. After the bodies, they turned to the canals, systematically breaking the irrigation system that had sustained the oasis for 4,000 years. No canals meant no field. No fields meant no food. No food meant no population. No population meant nobody left to rebuild. It was a trap with no exit. And it worked perfectly. Travelers who passed through in the years after described pure desolation, a desert reclaiming what had been farmland, ghost walls rising out of sand, the turquoise dome of Sultan Sanjar's tomb visible in the distance, surrounded by nothing. The region was eventually resettled, but never rebuilt. That version of Merv, the libraries, the observatories, the bazaars, the 500,000 lives, was gone for good. What the world lost isn't fully calculable. Manuscripts that existed nowhere else. Artisanal techniques passed down through generations, severed in a single moment. 4,000 years of agricultural knowledge that lived inside the people who maintained the canals and died with them. But the final point the text lands on is this: none of it was inevitable. The destruction was a series of choices, and so was everything that had been built. One generation at a time, across 40 centuries, people chose to build, to preserve, to pass it forward. One army chose differently.